Thank you.
Of course, yeah, no bother. I think that's us live now, Charlie. It's not coming up on Facebook yet, but it's coming through on this platform as being live.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you. Okay, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, colleagues from both HE and FE members of the EIS. My name is Charlie Montgomery. I'm the EIS Fellow President, and along with Holly Patrick, my equivalent, the EIS ULA President, we're very, very pleased to welcome you to this event and to welcome the opportunity to raise issues and ask questions with politicians representing parties standing at the forthcoming elections. There's a huge amount of issues that could be raised and questions that could be asked, but we don't have sufficient time for everything. So behind the scenes, the EIS organisers have taken a lot of your pre-submitted questions and they've summarised them, put them together for me to read out to our guests from the political parties to give their responses to. Basically, the way this will run is that in a moment or two, I'll stop blethering and I'll ask each of the party representatives in approximately a minute or so, just to introduce themselves, who they are, their party, obviously, what they're about, and the relationship to HEFE, if any, that there is. And then we'll move into the questions. When we're doing the questions, I'll try and read out the questions. Hopefully I'll make it. And the politicians will hopefully answer those questions and we will leave here satisfied and better informed, I hope. Hopefully they'll be able to do that in just a couple of minutes because we don't have a huge amount of time. I'll be indulgent, but not too indulgent. And at the end, I will ask each of the politicians in turn to tell us, HE and FE lecturers, why it would be in our interests to vote for their parties at the forthcoming elections. Now, some of the faces in front of you, you'll know, some you might not know, but I'm going to now pass over and ask each of them in turn in about a minute to introduce themselves to you. So if I start with yourself, Liam.
Thanks very much, Charlie, and thanks to your colleagues for hosting this hosting. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Liam Mcarthur. I have been for the last 14 years the representative in the Scottish Parliament for Orkney. Probably most relevant to this evening's discussions, I was Scottish Liberal Democrat education spokesperson in the session before last of the Scottish Parliament and sat on the education and then culture committee at the time. There was some suggestion that my leader, Willie Rennie, thought education and culture were the two things I needed. Can I say from the outset, listen, this has been a hugely difficult year or so for so many, but it would have been a very different pandemic without our universities and our colleges. They have been instrumental through their expertise in identifying and managing and now hopefully defeating COVID. And I think as we move into the next phase, over the next 5 years, Scottish Liberal Democrats are absolutely clear that the focus needs to be needle sharp on the recovery and not just a recovery to what was there before, but addressing the climate emergency as well. And central to that, again, will be our universities and our colleges. We need to see our colleges, again, the kind of bulwark within local economies in terms of stimulating economic development. That access to lifelong learning for which they are absolutely critical, and our universities as well, helping in terms of the rebuilding but the repurposing of our economy as well. So I look forward to this evening's discussions very much. Hopefully we'll be able to dive into some of those issues in more detail, but for now, Charlie, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Liam. Gordon, you're muted.
Good. Sorry. Thank you very much. I was elected as a Lothian Region MSP in 2016. Prior to that, worked in the courts as an advocate, so in the law. I suppose my connection to education, I have a family one. My father was a high school teacher in a state secondary. And I myself have taught in a European university as a part-time lecturer in the law faculty. So it sort of runs in the family that we have a bit of an interest in education, although I haven't held the education brief in my own party. However, in the last Parliament, for most of the Parliament, I was the convener of the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee. And part of the remit of that committee is looking at the question of fair work, which is one of the things I think we'll come to tonight. And that did involve universities and those in the higher education sector. So I look forward to your questions tonight and the discussion. And thank you very much for having all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Michael.
Thanks, Charlie. My name is Michael Mara. I'm the Scottish Labour Education spokesperson. I am not an MSP, or haven't been, but I am standing for election. I am our #1 candidate on the list in the North East of Scotland. And I work at the University of Dundee. I was actually in the office today for only the second time in, I think, 14 months. So a lot of dust around, it's fair to say. But I know what so many of your members and who'll be watching tonight have been going through, Charlie, in terms of this year and the extraordinary lengths they've gone to keep our education system working. And God, there's an awful lot more work to do. I'm from an EIS household, I suppose. Both my parents were teachers, activists and members, president of the local branch, etc., etc. So I've lived with that education and education politics my whole life. But it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I think this is my 4th EIS Hustings in the last couple of weeks, but maybe the last. But I'm delighted to be here. So thanks for us, Charlie.
Thank you. It's good to have you again, Richard. Again, Richard, you're muted.
Good evening, and thanks for organising the hustings this evening. I'm Richard Lockhead. I'm the SNP's candidate for Moray here in the north of Scotland. I've been in Parliament since 1999 and represented Moray since 2006. And for the last 2.5 years, I've been the Minister for Further Education, Higher Education and Science in the Scottish Government. And I just want to add, as others have done, my heartfelt thanks to all our staff and indeed learners in our colleges and universities throughout Scotland for the way they have got through COVID over the past year, helping support each other and learners in the case of staff, and also looking after their own health and their loved ones at the same time. I know it's been extraordinarily difficult, but you've done extremely well the way you've pivoted and home learning and everything else you've achieved to keep people safe and keep them learning. So thank you so much for that. Of course, I, after leaving school, went to college. And then after college, I worked for a couple of years and I did day release at college after being a full-time college student. And then I went to university after that and became a university student for 4 years as well. So, I experience of education in many different formats myself as well, and very much aware how our further and higher education sectors play such a role in making Scotland a great country and also opening up new life chances and life opportunities for the people of Scotland. So looking forward to tonight's discussion and questions.
Thanks very much, Richard. Ross.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm Ross Greer. I'm the Scottish Greens Education spokesperson and a member of the Parliament's Education Committee in the last session. The Scottish Greens have stood with EIS members, and particularly colleges lecturers, throughout the pandemic, but in the years before that as well, through your struggles for decent paying conditions, recognition of your professional roles. We've been with you on picket lines and at rallies. We've challenged government ministers and college management on this. On COVID safety in particular, I was challenging university principals in meetings with them. Greens know that colleges need lecturers, that your working conditions are student learning conditions. And we've listened to you and we've fought alongside you. I'm proud of that track record. We are a unionist party, a trade unionist party. Our manifesto proposes transformational change in the relationship between workers and management across our society. And across the education sector, we offer more of that kind of change, including changes in how colleges and universities are funded to ensure that deals agreed between yourselves and employers are actually honoured. I would hope that lecturers know that what you're getting when you vote for the Scottish Greens is an ally.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Ross. So just to sort of explain exactly how this is going to go, we now have some questions. Questions were submitted earlier and the organisers have put them together to try and get as many issues out as we possibly can. So it's going to be kind of like an FE question and an HE question kind of thing. But the very first question is probably equal to both and all sides, I suppose. And basically what we'd like to know is, if you're fortunate enough to be elected, and if your party is able to win an overall majority, no matter how likely or unlikely that sounds, and if on the Monday after the election, because there'll be a while to count all the votes, you're given the call from the new or current First Minister and told that you're going to be the FEHE Minister, what would be your priorities? What would you say? Liam, could I start with yourself again there? What would you want to do you think are the main things for FEHE?
Well, thanks, Charlie. I mean, I think, as I said in the earlier comments, our universities and colleges are going to be absolutely pivotal to rebuilding and repurposing the economy. And it seems to me that I was on the education committee when colleges went through the reorganisation, when we were promised by the government all manner of efficiencies and investment that would go back into the sector. But the financial state of our college sector still appears parlous, yet even more so than perhaps it was at that stage. Our universities likewise seem to be struggling for funding, which has gone down in relative terms to need over recent years. So it seems to me that primarily there needs to be funding directed through the Scottish Founding Council to address those two aspects. And I think the other thing I would want to see in early course is the implementation of a training bond that we've been proposing to open up access, particularly to college education for more people, because this is going to be, again, pivotal in terms of that rebuilding exercise that I talked about. Pardon me.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Liam. Gordon, if your party becomes the biggest and you become the FEHE Minister, what do you think you'd want to do first in the FEHE portfolio?
Well, thank you for the promotion, I suppose I should say, first of all. I think there's two major issues, and one of these is the funding of higher education, because the current funding model, we think as Scottish Conservatives, is unsustainable, and indeed it's something that I've discussed during the various meetings that I've had over the past 5 years with representatives of the universities here in Edinburgh. And I think the Scottish students are underfunded because their placements are only funded by about 92%, and there's a reliance on international students to fund the universities. And I think we've seen from the pandemic that we can't rely on that sort of structure. So the funding model needs to be looked at fundamentally. We need a sustainable funding model for Scottish universities going forward to protect the skills that they have and the international element and the benefits that we gain from that and other countries gain from their links here. And the other thing is something that we looked at in the Economy Committee, and that was about ensuring that young people understand and have the opportunity to do other things in terms of training, not just only have university in their sights, but colleges or apprenticeships, that sort of thing. I think that needs to be emphasised.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Michael, here's your big opportunity. You're the FEHE man on the Monday after the election. What are you going to do for us?
I think first and foremost, Charlie, is I would want to be communicating with all staff in colleges and universities across the country and telling them just how important they are to the recovery of this country. You know, we need an education-led recovery, and from the situation we've faced. We've had a greater loss of education than at any time since the introduction of universal schooling in this country in the last 14 months. The impact of that risks a lost generation. And we know that at the moment that some colleges' applications are down by 30%, that we've still got a third of learners who have to complete from last year. And we know that some colleges are facing apprenticeships down by 60%. You know, and we've got a group of people who may have lost up to 2 years of education. Now, college lecturers are vital to re-engaging that group of young people in particular, because youth unemployment is up by 50% in this country. So actually mobilising the workforce across FE and then into HE to talk to them about actually the key and critical role that they will play in actually the recovery and protecting that next generation of Scots, I think is the clearest message we have to send on day one. And whichever one of us ends up in that seat, I hope that that's what they will do. The other broader questions about financial sustainability clearly have to be worked on. There's huge issues right across both sectors in terms of the college and the perilous state that many of the balance sheets are in. The big contradiction is in a business model which I frankly think is broken in higher education, of balancing the books on the backs of foreign students who may not arrive come September. So there's critical things we have to do with that to make sure as many of them can as possible. So we have to make sure that university halls have the status of COVID hotels, that we can actually encourage the international market to send our students to Scotland so we can get that money in the door. That's absolutely critical. And the last thing I'll do, probably about 4:45 that afternoon, is I will phone the Welsh Labour government, I hope, and ask them to progress the discussions we've already had with the Welsh Labour Party about joining Turing Plus, the scheme that they're putting in place to ensure that we have the maximum connectivity into Europe. And I'm pretty confident that I'll get a warm welcome to that suggestion.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. Richard, you've got a slight advantage over everybody here. You've already been in this situation, but should you be returned and should you have this opportunity, or curse as some might see it, to be sitting there on the Monday as the FEHE Minister, what's your priorities going to be this time round?
Thanks, Charlie. Yes, an advantage or perhaps a disadvantage, as some of my colleagues may see it as. But I mean, obviously, I love the points that have been made. I absolutely agree with. I mean, firstly, there's many successes in further and higher education, and I think we've all got a duty to build on those. And I would want to build on the success of our further and higher education sectors in Scotland, because there's many marvellous things being achieved. But of course, there's massive challenges, and people are quite right, my colleagues, that recovering from COVID and ensuring we have an education-led recovery, and the FE and HE is at the heart of that, is what I'd be focused on if I was returned after the elections to the same post, which has been an honour to have over the last 2.5 years. First and foremost, we have to support learners, and that's the first task, is to support our learners who have been impacted by COVID and make sure they can get through and complete their courses. And secondly, make sure that our FE and HE sectors are playing their central role to rebuild the Scottish economy. And the economy may well be different to what it has been in the past, and therefore we have to make sure that our colleges and universities are up for that challenge, to upskill the population, to help create the new jobs that we need in the economy as well. So I think that's a kind of ballpark figure. We're at a crossroads at the moment. We have had COVID, we have to recover from that. We've got Brexit, we've got to recover from that. We've got demographic change in our country, therefore we have to adapt to that and make sure we get genuine lifelong learning. This is not just about young people anymore, it's about people throughout their whole lives, dipping in and dipping out to education at an appropriate time. And we have the climate emergency as well, and Scotland's got to play its role in that. So that's why I'd be focusing on that strategic approach.
Thanks very much, Richard. Ross, your opportunity then. The Greens win an overall majority. You become the FEHE Minister, and what are you going to do?
Beyond the kind of immediate urge to ask for a recount, I suppose it would be quite exciting. I mean, my first priority would be to intervene immediately, get on the phone to the principal at Forth Valley College. We've got a situation of fire and rehire, which is bang out of order. Now, government isn't the direct employer of lecturers, obviously, so it can't just snap its finger and solve this, but colleges are public bodies, and the government should be using its bully pulpit here to bring pressure to bear on Forth Valley and the other colleges that are engaged in this. So that would be number one immediate, because that's urgent. That's happening right now. There are staff who are being told that they can either face redundancy or do the same job on poorer paying conditions, which isn't acceptable. There's also, I'm aware of the support staff industrial action at Dundee and Abertay universities. Universities aren't public bodies, but as the Minister, I would certainly be getting on the phone to the principals of both of them and looking for a solution there. Long term, I think we absolutely need a solution to avoid this annual issue of disputes, but I'm aware we're coming to that in the next question, so I won't repeat myself. I think it's absolutely key that government is adequately funding colleges so that we are reintroducing part-time courses in particular. They were an amazing way for people who'd been marginalised, unable to access education from disadvantaged backgrounds, for them to be able to get in to FE. So to reverse what happened in the kind of 2012 to 15 period where a lot of those part-time courses went, that would be a major priority for me. I also really want to expand eligibility for bursaries for college students, especially for 16 and 17-year-olds who are often the students who need financial support the most but aren't getting it. So the Greens want to see more bursaries, and specifically for them to widen access to college. And finally, as has already been mentioned, the Greens want to see the funding of university tuition actually match the cost of it, so that universities aren't essentially dependent on exploiting international students and those who use their accommodation.
Okay, thanks very much to all of you. That was a sort of gentle question just to get us started, but we'll move on to other questions in just a moment. Just for the panel, if you look on the screen that we have, on the right-hand side, you'll see a bit that says comments. If you click on that, if you've got a thick skin, I'll warn you, if you've got a thick skin, if you click on that, you'll see some of the comments that some of our audience are making. And you might want to consider some of what they're saying as you're giving the answers to the questions. Obviously, we're not going to be able to fit everything in that they say, but if you look at that, you'll see, you might not want to see right enough how you're going down with the audience. The second question we have tonight, then, again, it says, suggested it's an FE question, but given the state of both sectors, I suppose it could be relevant to both sectors. The FE sector has recently, currently gone through a national dispute, which we believe was extended by the failure of the Employers Association to ratify its own deal, the deal put forward by its own negotiators. Although this week, thankfully, both sides have managed to get it ratified nationally. Do the panel agree that there's a greater scope for government intervention in these sorts of things? Certainly one of the things that FEHE members were very upset about, and I'm not going to pretend they weren't, was that it seemed to us that there was an acceptance by the government that this was an argument between the employers and the unions, and it was for them to keep out of it. I might be reading that wrong, and I certainly will give Richard an opportunity to respond to that. But it was our opinion that perhaps more could have been done. What do you think, Gordon? Should the government have done more to try and bring this dispute to an end? And if so, what should it have done? Again, Gordon, you're muted, I'm afraid. No. Seem to have lost you. That's you, Gordon, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, thanks very much. I think the government always has a particular role and a particular ability to actually help in such circumstances and situations. And I think probably here, as in a lot of other areas, the SNP government really didn't come up to the mark and failed in terms of trying to encourage people to be reasonable and come to an agreement, and for the agreement to be honoured that was discussed and looked at from the point of view of the negotiators. I mean, in the Economy Committee, not directly relevant to education, but we have always encouraged the government in terms of industrial disputes or issues involving, for example, BIFAB, to try and hold meetings, joint meetings, and I mean, it's with cross-party support in the committee to try and resolve issues. And I think in education that is the same. And I think really in this case, the government could have done more by spending a bit more time and putting a bit more effort into this situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Gordon. Michael, what do you think?
I certainly think that the government could have done more, should have done more. I'll start really though by saying that I'm really glad that the situation has, for the moment, resolved itself. But we know that this is something that keeps coming back, and that partly comes to the issue of the financial situation that colleges find themselves in. That they're pushing themselves to, frankly, make decisions which are pulling the terms and conditions of their staff into question, and is resulting in hiring practices which I don't actually think is going to support learners in the long run. So there's that issue of financial sustainability that has to be sorted out. I mean, we should remember that I believe the Forth Valley College issue is still ongoing. I've had meetings in the last week with Colleges Scotland who've made absolutely clear to me that they believe that fire and rehire is unacceptable. And that's the kind of message I think that Richard and his colleagues in the Scottish Government should be sending loud and clear, to directly to Colleges Scotland and to the principals of the colleges that are involved. They should be telling them the basis on which they are funded, and I think that the universities are a slightly different issue because they have a more kind of arm's length they're not arm's length, they're divorced from government in terms of government can't interfere as directly. But Richard essentially pays the bills in these colleges indirectly, and he can make some of these calls and he can pick up the phone. I said this to John Swinney on at Hustings we're on last week, that he should have been picking up the phone. Thankfully, it looks like we've got some kind of resolution, but we can't be back in the situation again next year. So the conversation has to start straight away next week, making sure that actually this doesn't reappear.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. Just before I bring you in, Richard, the Forth Valley College dispute is still ongoing. The fire and rehire dispute, as we refer to it. There is a question on that coming up, so we'll have a chance to speak about that. Richard.
Thank you. Also, I'm listening to my opposition colleagues closely. Firstly, I'm very obviously pleased that the dispute has been resolved, and it's a relief, I'm sure, for all concerned. It's a very, very difficult situation for lecturers to go on strike and take industrial action, and therefore, you use your right to do that. Clearly, we've put a lot of effort in collectively, the unions, employers, government, in recent years to set up national bargaining, to fund that national bargaining and the negotiating machinery that goes with that. Where there is a dispute and where the government's not at the table, the best way to resolve that dispute, as has happened, thankfully, eventually, is for the Employers Association and the EIS FEHE to reach an agreement. That is by far the best way to resolve these disputes. I did, as Minister, of course, speak to both sides on more than one occasion, urging them to exhaust all opportunities to get round the table, to keep talking, to get to a resolution. And again, as I said, I'm very, very pleased we have reached that. In terms of industrial relations within the sector, we may return to that in another question, I'm not sure. Of course, there are lessons to learn. It's not in anyone's interest that we have these strikes. I know, as I said before, it's the last thing that you want to do as union representatives, is to get yourselves involved in strike action. Therefore, we've got to learn lessons, and lessons will be learned in terms of the wider issue over industrial relations, but in this case in the FE sector. So we will take that forward. That's already underway. Of course, in the pre-election period, intervention by any minister is not looked upon very well in terms of the codes we have to abide by. But I'm just glad that this strike's over, and I hope that both sides can constructively move forward in the interests of learners and indeed the profession of lecturers, which is the backbone of our colleges.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Richard. It's good to hear from you on that matter. Ross.
Thanks, Charlie. Yes, there was definitely greater scope for intervention from the government. This was one of the last issues that I raised in the chamber in Parliament before Parliament broke for recess at March for the election. Colleges are public bodies, but they're allowed to behave, or their management are allowed to behave like they're private enterprises, as if they aren't really accountable to government. And that's just not the case. I think long term, what we need to look at to break this cycle, because it is a cycle. I've become very used to joining you all on picket lines and at rallies, etc., almost like clockwork every year. And you're right to take that action, but it shouldn't be necessary in the first place. So to break that cycle, one of the things I think we need to look at now is tripartite negotiations. So direct government involvement in these negotiations in exactly the same way that we've already got when it comes to teachers through the SNCT. We need to do something to break this cycle. And I don't think that in and of itself automatically fixes it, but it's a change that I think is necessary to have that codified, regular, direct government involvement with this, because colleges are public bodies and they are publicly funded. So I don't see any reason why not. I think the other part of the solution here is to tie funding from the colleges, so the Scottish Funding Council budgets that they get, to tie that to much stricter requirements around honouring the deals that they've entered into with the union, and on wider standards or higher standards in employment practices, as well, not just for lecturers, but particularly for support staff, for contractors, etc. We should be attaching much higher standards and expectations to those who receive public money, especially if they are a public body. And one other thing that I'm really keen to do here is for Parliament to take a much greater role. This isn't something that the Education Committee was able to look at in the last term of Parliament because there were a number of other major issues, but it was a real source of frustration I really wanted us to. So if I'm re-elected, one of the first things that I'll propose is that Parliament's Education Committee hold an inquiry into this, because it has happened, some variation of the same dispute has happened so many years in a row now, and it would be a failure of Parliament to let that keep happening. So I think a parliamentary inquiry into this, looking at some recommendations to break that cycle, would be helpful. I think Parliament's Audit Committee did a pretty good job a couple of years ago when it was the really questionable financial issues, when we had the college mergers, the golden goodbyes, the golden hellos, the principals getting obscene amounts of money. That proved that Parliament can play a really powerful and a really useful role here, not just government. But I hold my hands up. Parliament's been a bit missing in action on this one in terms of the Education Committee for the last 5 years. So that's one of the first things I would do, is get that inquiry underway.
Thanks very much, Ross. Liam, do you want to bring this section to an end?
Yeah, no, look, I echo the comments of others that there is relief that a resolution's been found, but as others have observed, this is almost cyclical, and therefore there's something systemic wrong here. I think Michael's comments about College of Scotland position in relation to Forth Valley, which I know we're coming on to, would be a strong indicator of how that particular dispute needs to now be resolved, and resolved with some urgency. I mean, I would disagree with Ross in relation to the more direct involvement of the Scottish Government. That said, I think that the involvement of the Scottish Government can be deployed more effectively, not least because of the funding links that there are. I think we need to be slightly careful in the way that financial power and the soft power that ministers and government have is deployed. But I think it clearly could be more activist than it has been to date. I think where I would agree with Ross is that in relation to this being an issue that the Education Committee can usefully look at in early course in the next session, I think that is a very sensible idea. And I think before the committees start getting bunged up with legislation coming forward, it's an area where I think a good going piece of research could very usefully be done in the first sort of 3 to 6 months of the incoming Parliament. And I'm sure it's an area in which there'd be a pretty strong cross-party agreement in taking it forward.
Thanks very much, Liam. I'm sure we'll return to a couple of these themes and some of the other questions. But I've got to say on behalf of FEHE, certainly, that we definitely feel that there needs to be more of a hands-on approach. We don't want to see ourselves negotiating with the government, but we do want to feel valued by the government and not simply be left to constantly, and it is constantly, be fighting over and over again with our employers. But that's something for you all to consider should you wake up on the Monday as the FEHE Minister. The next question that we have has come in from the HE side, and I'll just find it again. Sorry, I just lost it there. Yeah. So again, it could quite easily have been from the FE side as well, relating largely to Brexit. So how will the panel address the challenges that have arisen for HE since Brexit? In particular, the funding gaps. How will the funding gaps be addressed? Issues like collaborative research opportunities expanded, and the freedom to work and study across the EU belt. If your party is elected, how are you going to deal with these issues, which are hugely important for both sectors, but particularly the HE sector? So if I start with yourself, Michael.
Yeah, I can well recall, Charlie, when I attended Glasgow University as an undergraduate, and basically our tutorials were made up of me and mostly Glaswegians, and it was a pretty narrow conversation about politics, history, and the rest, it's fair to say. But when I ended up teaching in the same room 15 years later, we had people from around Europe and around the world. And actually the richness that they added to the education experience for young Scots who were in the room, and learning from each other, and actually as a tutor, a lecturer, somebody who was learning from them on day-to-day business. When you're talking about politics and political systems and other issues like that, it was a fascinating thing. So I first want to say that young people and mature learners coming into our country add huge value to our education and our culture. not just money into our institutions, but they do help to pay the bills. And part of the disaster of Boris's horrendous Tory Brexit has been the chilling of some of those links, I think, into Europe. And the cutting off of opportunities to work with our colleagues in institutions across Europe. I've had amazing academic experiences working with researchers in Spain and in France and Germany and Italy, right across, and mostly online, it's fair to say, but when we've had that chance of working face to face, and it adds a real richness and understanding as a researcher and an academic. So we have to do everything we can to make sure we maintain those links. But there is, I also said, and I think I touched it earlier on this, that actually Brexit has partly exposed the precariousness of the Scottish funding model, where when the SNP came in, they have underfunded Scottish students and made universities seek money from elsewhere to basically fill the gap in the funding. And that's driven the business models for the last 14 years. Of Scottish universities, and now we could find in September that system has completely broken. We just don't know, frankly. We don't know, Richard. We don't genuinely whether some of these students or enough of these students will turn up. So we will wait and see. And I know that my colleagues in the recruitment.
Yeah, a wee bit, Michael.
Yeah, my colleagues in the recruitment department are really worried about that. So what do we have to do? I've mentioned Turing Plus already, and we have to deal with the funding issue because we can't allow our universities to be as precarious as they are right now.
Okay, I know you were very keen to get in there, Richard, so on you go.
I don't think I've met many people who work in our colleges or universities in this case who voted for Brexit, and certainly very few young people who are, of course, are very much affected in terms of losing their rights. So it's a huge issue for further and higher education, Brexit, and we've not seen all the damage yet because a lot of our success for universities has been based on their internationalism and on our collaboration with other European countries. And now the UK, and in this case Scotland, is much less of an attractive location for the best brains in Europe to come to study or to work. Unfortunately, we'll do what we can as a government in Scotland, and if we're re-elected, we've got a lot of ideas in a manifesto to make sure we have an enhanced international strategy for HE and to bring forward support for establishing relationships with European universities and a successor to Erasmus, which of course we've been taking out against our will as well. In terms of finances, which is at the heart of the question, clearly we had 10 years of austerity from Westminster Tory governments from 2010 onwards. And we protected the funding for FE and HE, in this case again HE, of over £1 billion a year, despite the 10 years of austerity. And through COVID, we've delivered an extra £200 million for FE and HE, including £75 million for research for HE and our universities. So we've stood by them in very difficult times. But I think we're all agreed that we have to do a lot more to get our universities through this. And outcomes have been very positive from our universities. I keep hearing that they're busted flushes and they're broke and they're all going busted. That's not the case, and really should not talk in that kind of language. We've got record numbers of students at our universities in Scotland. We've just had a record number of applications from non-EU countries to our universities in Scotland. And many of our international students who we feared would not arrive this academic term did arrive. And Michael's quite right. We don't know what the situation is for next term, and anything could happen internationally with travel. Thankfully, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and hopefully they will arrive again. They arrived in the middle of the pandemic, so hopefully, fingers crossed. We also don't know. But I have commissioned the Scottish Funding Council to look at the sustainability financially and the coherence of HE in Scotland because of Brexit, of COVID, and some wider challenges we do face. So I do accept, that we have got to take note of our dependency on international students. But that was very much a sign of the success of our universities in attracting international students. But we've got to be very careful, and that's why we've commissioned the SFC review to look at the future of HE and FE and finance.
Okay, Richard, thanks very much for that. Ross?
Thanks. I mean, Richard's obviously right that Scottish universities are massively successful, and per head of population, some of the most successful in the world. But our universities have really good outcomes because of the Herculean efforts that their staff are putting in. And you just need to look at the mental health surveys of academic staff in particular to see the cost of keeping the show on the road for many of these staff. They're doing it despite the fact that there's been this lack of effective support from government. I've already mentioned the need for funding to actually match the cost of tuition when it comes to Scottish students. That's the single most important action that government can take here in terms of the funding of universities that will allow the adequate numbers of staff to be available, decent conditions for the staff to be working in. But on this point and on a lot of my others, I mean, I will be committing to huge amounts of spending on behalf of the Greens here. We have actually figured where we would raise this money from. So the Greens have already made changes to income tax in Scotland, so the richest people pay a bit more to fund our public services. What we're proposing this time round is a wealth tax on millionaires to raise the money we need for our recovery. So we're not just writing blank checks here, we know where the money's coming from. The universities are independent institutions, but when it comes to public funding going to them, anybody that receives public funding, whether it is a public agency, a university, a private business, etc., there should be conditions attached to that around standards of employment, particularly for, in universities' case, for support staff, graduate teaching assistants, etc. I mean, we've got graduate teaching assistants who are working, and because of the number of hours they need to work, they're working for less than the minimum wage in a lot of cases, and that's just completely unacceptable. In terms of what we've lost from Brexit and trying to maintain and protect those international links, I'm still absolutely committed to Scotland rejoining the Erasmus programme. Brexit didn't mean that we had to leave Erasmus. That was pure vandalism from the Conservatives. And to the credit, Michael mentioned it, the credit of the Labour Liberal government in Wales, their Erasmus equivalent scheme is really good. It's far, far better than what the UK government have proposed through.
Hurry a wee bit, Ross.
No bother. So we would be committed to trying to rejoin Erasmus, and if not, to work with the Welsh on that scheme. And the very last point I would make is to expand the Scottish Government's own international presence, the offices they've got in various other countries, to make it that bit easier to support smaller institutions in establishing their own international links. So it's not just the big players, the ancients, etc., who are able to do that with the resources they've already got.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Ross. I was going to ask a sort of supplementary question about Erasmus, actually, because Ian Hunter raised it in the comments section, but we'll come back to that just at the end. Liam.
Thanks, Charlie. Well, let me touch on that to start off with. I mean, I think Ross and Michael are right that not only was our withdrawal from Erasmus entirely unnecessary, I think we have an example of how that can be remedied, and I think my colleague Kirsty Williams in Wales and our Labour colleagues have demonstrated how that can be achieved. I would very much want to see Scotland go down that route. I would say that I wouldn't want to see us compound the problems created by Brexit with a march towards independence and a referendum over the course of this Parliament. But I think it seems to be generally accepted that the financial model that our universities are operating at the moment, Richard may say that it may not be as bad as some claims, but I think there are vulnerabilities in it that have been exposed by COVID and need addressing. I would want to see now that perhaps some of the toxicity of the debate around Brexit has diluted a bit, that the governments across the UK are hunting down areas of collaboration, whether it's in research, whether it's in terms of initiatives like the French Talent Initiative that the Labour Lib Dem administration put forward in the second session of Parliament. There are areas where we can be doing so much more because there is no doubt that the part of the strength of our university sector in particular has been that diversity. It's a diversity that's been cultivated over many years. It's suffered a shock to the system as a result, not just of Brexit, but the debate leading up to Brexit. And I think it's incumbent upon all politicians now to, as I say, be hunting down those areas of collaboration and working as hard as we can to build those bridges over the coming years.
Thanks, William. The last word to yourself, Gordon. And again, you're muted. Sorry, there you go.
Am I?
Yes.
Excellent. You can hear me now. Thank you very much. I mean, I touched on the issue of funding for universities at the outset, because I think that's something seriously needs to be looked at, and others have commented on the current funding model, which I think has developed over the years. I think it's something that perhaps we all recognise needs to be looked at now. And on the Brexit front, I mean, as Richard's pointed out, there doesn't seem to be a fall away in the interest in Scottish universities, which is a good thing. And I think that may partly be because of the more global outlook of some of the European institutions, the European students, for example. I mean, the Turing scheme from the UK government is meant to be a more global scheme and not just focus in Europe. But if I just give the anecdotal example of where I teach at the University of Bonn, I teach German law students about Scottish court procedure, which you might be astonished the interest that people in other countries have in Scotland and how we do things and the quality they see in the way we do things. But a lot of those students are not necessarily German students themselves, but they're from other countries, and for them English sometimes is a third language, they having moved to Germany and then learnt German, studied there, and then studying about Scottish court procedure in English. So I think it comes back to how our attitude, or what our attitude is in this country, and that we need our pupils to have the opportunities to learn other languages, to learn these things that will give them that international interest and ability to reach out and do these things regardless of what the governments and the politics of the situation is.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Just before we move off this, there's been a few comments from the audience there about the Erasmus scheme, and one or two of you touched on it. But I'd just like to ask you, if you could very briefly, because I'm taking advantage of things here, but just very briefly, do you believe that we should, as a priority, rejoin the Erasmus scheme? And if so, how would you manage to achieve that? If I could start with yourself, Ross.
Yes, the short answer is yes, absolutely. It should be a priority for us to rejoin Erasmus. And it's Greens in the European Parliament who are working to make that possible right now. There's 2 members of the European Parliament who are working on a path for Scotland to rejoin Erasmus. One's a Christian Democrat, so a German Conservative, would you believe it? His dad's Scottish. And the other's a German Green who did her Erasmus year at Edinburgh University. So as a Green elected in Scotland, I would work with my partners, my friends across Europe who are already working to give us the opportunity to do that. Obviously, the one way that we can secure our future in Erasmus in the long term is to become an independent nation and make these choices for ourselves.
Okay, thanks very much, Ross. Richard.
Love Scotland to rejoin Erasmus. And it may be that the only way to do that is through independence, but we are certainly exploring if there are other ways to do that. And I've spoken personally to the 2 MEPs that Ross mentioned about their good work in reaching the hand, extending the hand of friendship to Scotland as well. Can I just correct something that was said earlier on? There's a decline in EU applications to our universities, quite a sharp decline. There's an increase in non-EU applications, but it's really bad news that there's a decline in EU applications from students, our students in the EU to our institutions.
Okay, thanks for that. Michael.
Yeah, I think I've covered our proposals reasonably well already, Charlie, to join up with Wales in their Turing Plus replacement scheme. But if we can get into Erasmus, real Erasmus, I'm all for it. Okay,
thanks very much. Gordon?
Yes, I mean, I think I commented the UK government scheme is intended to be a bit broader than just Europe, as the Erasmus scheme was more focused on. The Scotland, of course, the beauty of devolution is that we can seek to approach things from our own point of view. And I think it will be interesting to see what the Scottish government comes up with in terms of what it wants to see made available to students.
Thanks very much, Gordon. Liam?
Yeah, I should probably start with declaring an interest. My eldest son's at Dundee Uni and was supposed to be going to Leiden University on Erasmus at the start of last year, but COVID did for that. I would dearly love to see us back in Erasmus. I think the fact that there are colleagues within the European Parliament and across Europe who want to see us back into Erasmus doesn't surprise me, and is something we should be looking to leverage as hard as we can. But there is a fallback, as Michael and I have acknowledged, with the scheme in Wales, and if that is the way of recreating Erasmus particularly for our young people, then let's grab at that plan B. But getting back in Erasmus directly would certainly be the preferred option.
Okay, thank you all very much for that. It does seem that both the politicians and the audience are in agreement that we should be back in Erasmus if that's possible, so that might be something for you to consider after the election. If we can move on to the next question then. And again, it's from FE, and unsurprisingly, it kind of focuses on the disputes that we've had very recently in the FE sector. And the question is, do you agree that everyone who plans lessons, teaches lessons, and assesses learning in lessons in Scotland's colleges should be a lecturer? And if you do agree, what's your view about the 3 local disputes there in Fife, West Lothian and Forth Valley College currently where this is an issue? It does seem to many in the FE sector that quality is being eroded in order to bring in cheaper alternatives. And it does worry us, not just from our own point of view, but also from our students whose education will be affected by this. Richard, what's your view?
My view is that we need professional lecturers at the heart of further education in Scotland, and that these 3 disputes are incredibly unfortunate. And I will continue to urge all the parties concerned to please keep negotiating until any of all these disputes can be resolved. I'm also pleased that the recent statistics just released showed an increase in the number of professional lecturers in Scotland, not a decrease, and I think that's a great thing. And we also, of course, have the best paid lecturers amongst the home nations as well, which I'm very proud of, that we've managed to achieve working closely with you over the last few years. So, of course, each principal has to have the flexibility to decide the nature of their own workforce, to take into account local circumstances. And we have had hundreds of assessors and instructors working in our colleges for many years now. But that should not be at the expense of lecturers at the heart of the system, and I will fight to maintain that. And I just hope that these disputes can be resolved sooner rather than later. And I'm sure whoever's the next minister will take a very close interest in making sure that happens, using what influence they do have available to them.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much. Just before I move on, you'll not be surprised to know that I'm going to pursue you a wee bit on this. So I'll just repeat the first part of that question. Do you agree that everyone who plans lessons, teaches lessons, and assesses learning in lessons in Scotland's colleges should be a lecturer? Straightforward question, Richard. Could you?
Of course, it sounds like a lecturer to me, but it's for you and your employers to define the role of a lecturer, and that's what you've just been discussing through your recent dispute, which thankfully has now been resolved. So I hope you've reached a good agreement about the definition of a lecturer.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thank you, Ross.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm pretty sure that the number of registered lecturers has increased, not because more people are being recruited, but because of the GTCS registration process. It's the same folk who were doing the same jobs this time last year and the year before. It's just a change in registration, a long overdue and welcome one, though. In answer to the question, though, yeah, if you are planning lessons, if you're teaching lessons, if you're assessing lessons in a college, you are a lecturer. And what's going on is fire and rehire, and it should be banned. And that's why, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we should be doing that. I think the way to do that is probably through setting conditions in the SFC funding process. You know, these are 3 colleges that are now out of step with the deal that has been agreed, and we've been going through this for years as individual colleges or college management as a whole through Colleges Scotland not honouring the deals that have been agreed. We just need to set stricter conditions in the funding council process, because these are public bodies funded by public money. If you know they need to get that money to operate, and the requirement of that should be honouring the deals. There's another wider issue though about reforming college governance in individual institutions, in individual colleges. We need a much more collaborative approach. And that often sounds like a really vague, abstract word that doesn't really mean anything. But what that means in practice is we need more involvement, more staff reps, both lecturers and support staff on the boards of individual colleges. I think we need a rethink of how the governance of colleges at an individual institution level works. But in answer to the first question, yes, this is fire and rehire. We should be banning it, and I believe that we have the powers at our disposal through government funding to do that.
And thanks very much for answering the question, Ross. Thank you. Liam.
Yeah, I think I said earlier, I mean, any move to kind of fire and rehire seems to me to be antithetical to what we should be looking to achieve within the college sector. I mean, it seems to me that It's a microcosm of the problem that's beset the college sector more generally, in that it has been, I think, largely undervalued, despite some of the rhetoric in recent years. I think that the reorganisation exemplified that for me, and I think what we're seeing here is that being played out on a campus, on a college by college basis. So I'm not privy to the details in each of those 3 cases. If they've been resolved, then hopefully we've got a blueprint for avoiding them in future. But as we've already touched on, this seems to be a cyclical process. And as I say, I think it boils down to the fact that if we do not value colleges, if we do not value staff, then I think hoping that our colleges will be able to help lift us towards the sort of recovery and the repurposing of our economy that we want to see, I think is a faint prospect.
Thanks for that, Liam. But just so that I'm clear, I'm going to ask you the same as I asked Richard, because I'm not entirely sure. Do you believe, do you agree rather, that everyone who plans lessons, teaches lessons and assesses learning and lessons in Scotland's colleges should be a lecturer, Liam? What would your answer be?
Well, I mean, it seems to me, Charlie, that what you've described is something that would fall within the lecture, within the bracket of a lecturer. As I say, the detail of the disputes and the discussions that have been taking place between those 3 colleges and union representatives will have hopefully come to an agreement on the precise definition. But what's laid out there to a layperson and to somebody whose involvement in terms of the development of educational policy is a few years now out of date since I was last on the committee. But it seems to me that fundamentally describes the role of a lecturer.
Thanks very much for that. Gordon?
Yes, well, I think it's really down to the Scottish Government to provide the necessary funding to the colleges themselves in these unfortunate disputes. Of course, it's better if people can resolve disputes. I don't know the detail of the specific cases, so I'm not going to comment on those. And those involved will know it far better than me. I think as far as lecturers concerned, of course, as someone with a lawyer's background, definitions are key because what do you define as a lecturer? And in terms of colleges, of course, there shouldn't be ever a case of people being fired and rehired purely to save money. And the education of the students should not be put at risk simply for cost-saving exercises. So I think that's as clear as I can be on that, unless you want to come back with the question again.
I'm just going to say the same thing to you, Gordon. Do you think that the definition that we have given here is that of a lecturer, and that a lecturer should be the person carrying out these things?
Well, I mean, it's a question of definition. I mean, if that's what you define as a lecturer and the colleges agree that, then I'm saying quite clearly that there shouldn't be circumstances where people are simply being forced to take lower pay with the potential consequences for students simply for the sake of cost-cutting exercises.
Okay, Gordon. Thank you anyway. Thank you. Michael?
Thanks, Charlie. I know that this, through discussions with college principals and College Scotland, that this issue about there's the 6 responsibilities that were on the table and discussion about which were in the pile and which weren't in the pile, and that seemed to be the kind of the nub of the issue in terms of how that dispute might be resolved. I think your definition that you've offered to me there seems to be entirely reasonable, and I would support it in terms of. But I think that the dynamic behind the scenes of that is actually, and I can tell from the EIS's representations to me, has been that actually this is about replacing people who were doing those jobs with people who are perhaps less qualified, less experienced. And this is the purpose of doing this, in the view of the union, is to actually de-skill that workforce. And that quite clearly is not going to be helpful to learners. It's not going to result in secure employment for our lecturers. And it disrespects the profession in that regard. So we have to, as much as the nub of how you resolve it comes to the definition, it's that dynamic behind the scenes that's actually driving the position. And I would say on that, Richard said in his that he was very proud that he had the highest paid lecturers in the UK, and by working with you. So Richard wants to take the upside and claim responsibility for things that he thinks has gone well, but on the downside, it's this is somebody else's problem. And I don't think that that's a reasonable way for government to perform, frankly.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Michael. I'm hopeful, very hopeful, that the management teams at West Lothian, Fife, and of course Forth Valley are listening to your answers. I hope that what you're saying is that you agree that professional, qualified people should be teaching our students and not cheaper alternatives. And I think that's the fairest way of summarising what all of you have said. We believe that definition is one of a lecturer, and we hope that you act upon that if any of you become the FEHE minister or your parties are in government. Okay, we'll move on because we are not overloaded with time. We'll move on to the next question, which I believe is, excuse me, I've just lost it again. There we are. It's from the HE sector again, but yet again, this could just as easily be from the FE sector. How will the panellists, if elected, improve job security, tackle insecure contracts, and tackle the inequalities that these contracts create for academic staff? And I do have to say, if you're looking to the colleges and the universities to lead the way out of the economic and social and political problems we have or are going to be having post-COVID, then you really have to look to the teaching staff and the way they're being treated. I don't see how it can be acceptable to have so many people on such insecure contracts and used in the way they are. And the very fact that there are, in fact, 0-hour contracts still in operation in these sectors, despite what the government has said. So what are your views on the insecurity of many, many lecturers in the FEHE sector? Ross, I'll start with yourself.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, we've got a situation at the moment where, for example, you've got graduate teaching assistants working for not just less than the living wage, but less than the minimum wage because of the volume of work that they've got and the nature of their 0 hours contract. The number of hours they have to do to complete it means they're getting less than the minimum wage on an hourly basis. Look, universities are independent institutions. I'm sure other colleagues will mention that. That means government can't and shouldn't interfere in academic matters. It's not for any of us in Parliament to be dictating what's on the curriculum, but they do receive large amounts of public money. It's not the only funding source for unis. They're more diverse, obviously, than colleges, but they receive a huge amount of public money. And we should be making anyone's receipt of public money conditional on good employment practices. The Scottish Government's got this fair work agenda, and yet there are basically no conditions in terms of public procurement or the granting of, whether it's money to private businesses or, for example, here, around these basics, around guarantees of things like a living wage. So we should be making the granting of this money. We should be making the money governments give to universities conditional on elimination of 0 hours contracts, decent wages, etc., for academic staff, also for support staff as well. If we want to go beyond that, that's using the kind of specific mechanism that's available to us here, though, and I think we should do that. It's something we can do immediately. Beyond that, we need the devolution of employment law so that we can take action on setting a real living wage for everyone in the country, regardless of the sector or the institution that they work in. If we get devolution of employment law here in Scotland, we can set a real living wage as the minimum wage. We can mandate recognition of trade unions. We can properly ban 0 hours contracts. At the moment, what we're trying to do, or what we're proposing, is workarounds using the powers that are already devolved. This is one of the many reasons why Greens want independence, so that all these powers come to our Parliament, and we can do this not on a sector by sector or institution by institution basis, but we can do it nationally, because every worker in the country deserves a living wage, decent conditions, etc. But I think with universities, it's simply a matter of setting these conditions when it comes to the money they get every year from the government anyway.
Okay, thanks very much. Liam?
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, I mean, I think the disruption caused to our university sector and our college sector from the process of another independence referendum and the aftermath of that would act as a counterweight to any benefits that Ross has identified. But nevertheless, I think the casualisation of many of these roles is it may herald some short-term benefit, but I think in the medium to longer term, it is not in anybody's interest. We've seen that in our school sector, we're seeing it in the college sector, as you were saying, Charlie, and we're seeing it in the universities sector. I think if you undervalue your staff, then not only do you make it less likely you're able to hold on to the good quality staff, but attracting staff to join the sector becomes that much more difficult. If we truly believe that our university sector is the jewel in the crown, if we believe that our college sector need to be the bulwark of the recovery we need to see over the next 5 years, then central to that will be valuing the staff that are working in it, not just lecturers, but support staff, all those within the sector, without whom they would not be punching above their weight in the way that they have. I think there are powers there that allow us to do that, and they are the funding mechanisms principally that we have both in the university and the college sector, and we need to be using those more effectively.
Okay, thanks, Liam. Just before I come to yourself, Gordon, I need to say I'll need to speed you all up a wee bit. I'm being told I'm being too lax, so I'll need to hurry up a wee bit. Gordon.
Thank you. I'll try and be quick then. I mean, the difficulty is, I think, fair work. The Scottish Government has talked a lot about fair work, and there are a lot of things. I mean, again, it's not just education's affected by this, and this is something that we discussed quite often in the Economy Committee over the past 5 years, and how to try to progress matters in this. And the Scottish Government talks a lot about fair work, and some very good ideas in there, but the difficulty is the money and the funding and the approach, which I think Ross has partly pointed out, needs to match that and actually has to work together as it does in other European countries. And I don't see that independence will make us actually work things out in this area if we're not doing anything at the minute to actually achieve what we could do. And I accept it's a difficult balancing act, but the Scottish Government, the SNP government, has not really made the effort that it could have done.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Michael.
If we want great people to build brilliant careers in our universities, then we have to create a secure path from somebody who comes in as an undergraduate, gets a master's, ends up doing their PhD, and thinks, actually, this is a place where I can make a difference to society, where I can earn a living, I actually can pay for my family, and have a pension that's affordable at the end. And, you know, frankly, there's plenty holes in that pathway at the moment. You know, as somebody who regularly advertises for staff to come in, at times it can be really difficult. And part of that is about there are people, I think, young Scots in particular, who look at the situation and the workload that's in front of them, how precarious some of those steps are, where you can basically fall into a pit and not have that kind of pathway to a proper academic career as a lecturer and a researcher. And it's very, very difficult, I think. So you know, I've taught on one of these contracts before, and you know, we would be in a lot better position if we could offer a better, more supported, secure direction. Look at what people have done in HE in the last year. I mean, if I can say quickly, I know I'm indulging myself here, but you know, my university burnt millions and millions and millions of pounds on an IT program to try and put all our work online over a period of a decade. And frankly, it was a bunch of teaching staff, lecturers, who put the whole of the curriculum within a matter of weeks online and did complete digital transformation of the institution. You know, if we value our people, tell them what they're worth, actually they deserve proper contracts. And frankly, this last year has been a good example of why.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Richard. Yeah, sorry, Richard, couldn't hear you there. Do you want to start again?
Yeah, it must have been you that unmuted me. I'm unmuted. The points made, I totally agree with in terms of attracting the best staff to work in our universities. We have to ensure they can have as much security as possible with their contracts, and no less than any other sector of our economy, especially. The innovative approach we have taken through the Fair Work Convention and the Fair Work Principles is signed up to by the EIS and the STUC and the Scottish Government. So I don't think we should rubbish it, because we all signed up to this and we're all trying to make it work. And it has led to some benefits in some sectors of society. And I would like to see it leading to more benefits in HE, and I agree with that. And the SNP's manifesto talks about using Fair Work first to tackle fire and rehire, which we've spoken about a lot in this meeting, and to address some of the other issues that are touched upon by the question as well. The other point, the final point I would make is that, at the moment, we've got a debate in the Scottish Parliament about devolving employment law. That's the easiest way to deal with this. Labour won't support that, the Conservatives won't support that, I don't think. So we need to get all the parties to agree that we need a devolution of employment law. We do fund 40% of HE's university budgets, not 100%. So we can have some influence, but not total influence. The best way to do this is through legislation, but we don't have the powers in the Scottish Parliament. And meanwhile, the UK government are turning around one day suddenly and cutting research funds to our universities mid-contract, as happened a few weeks ago. That's the first time that's ever happened, is research contracts have been cut mid-contract. So that's real insecurity, and that's because of the UK government taking money off UKRI, the research councils. So we have to address those issues as well to give security to staff.
Okay, thank you. I don't think it's overstating the point, however, just to re-emphasise, if you're going to look to the FE and HE sectors to lead our country out of the problems, we cannot have a workforce that's even partially sustained on 0 hours contracts and low levels of permanency and all the problems that brings. It's a huge amount of inequality for the people who have to do that. It's extremely difficult for them to carry out their tasks. And it's somewhat ironic if they're going to be educating and training the workforce of the future under workforce of the past terms and conditions. So I hope you will think of that should any of you find yourself in a position of power. The next question is from the FE sector, and I suppose is one that is very much the burning question for FE lecturers at this moment. So what is your view, panel, of the decision of Forth Valley Management to regrade 25 lecturers into lesser paid posts with poorer working conditions, whilst delivering learning to students? And do you support the strike at Forth Valley, which is, in our opinion, very much at the heart of the fire and rehire debate? So I'll start with yourself, Gordon.
Well, I mean, this issue is something that is, of course, best dealt with by negotiation, discussion, and sensible agreement by both sides. But I've already said that I don't think colleges should be engaged in simply firing and rehiring on worse terms and conditions. So I don't want to go into the individual issues in that particular dispute, because I think others will know better than I do what the detail of it is. But I mean, I think that's the general principle that I would certainly stand behind, that all lecturers and those working in colleges should have fair working conditions and terms and conditions.
Well, I think I should thank you for your brevity, because we need the time, but I don't know, do you want to add anything to that? Do you think the Forth Valley College are correct in this fire and rehire policy?
Well, I think I've made my position clear on what I think of things, without saying that I want to speak directly about the specifics, which I'm sure those watching will know a lot more about than me.
Okay, thank you very much. Liam.
Yeah, I think I said earlier, it seems to me that a process of firing and rehiring in order to cut costs is not the way any college should be going. I think the view that Colleges Scotland appears to have expressed on this would give an indication of how unacceptable that practice should be within our college sector. I mean, a little like Gordon, I'm not across the detail of the discussions that have taken place, but I think a means of cutting costs by simply firing, rehiring experienced and skilled individuals into posts is an unsustainable model and absolutely should be rejected.
Okay, thank you. Ross.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier the Scottish Greens absolutely support the strike action that's been taken at Forth Valley. I mean, this practice of downgrading lecturer positions to course instructor, assessor, etc., whatever title they come up with, that is bad enough when it's happening in cases where lecturers have retired or moved on to other employment, where instead of a like-for-like replacement, they do a downgrade, because that's undermining the professional role of lecturers. What's happening at Forth Valley is so much worse, because it's real people. It's individuals who are being told you can either lose your job or you can turn up next week to do the same job. We've got the same expectations of you, but the paying conditions are going to be poorer. That is the definition of fire and rehire, and it is completely unacceptable. I've already mentioned how we think that this can be addressed through conditions in the Scottish Funding Council system, through changing of the negotiation structure to involve the government more, and also direct governance changes at individual colleges. I think what we've got, and Forth Valley is probably sadly a good example of this, or a terrible example, but an apt one, where you have principals who still hold a huge amount of power, and boards that are frankly ineffective or not nearly effective enough, and boards that are not representative enough, don't represent the interests of everyone involved, particularly the staff. So reform of individual governance, particularly the board at Forth Valley College. I think we need to reform nationally how we do the funding of this, but we need to just be unequivocal about what this is. It's fire and rehire, and it is just completely unacceptable. There are people who are being forced to either lose their job or accept far lesser paying conditions to turn up and do exactly the same thing.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ross. Richard.
As I said before, the SNP manifesto does have proposals to tackle fire and rehire within it, using the Fair Work agenda. And Ross is quite right. The way we do that within FE and HE is through the letters of guidance from the Scottish Funding Council to our colleges and universities. And that is the only way we can really influence this. And that's certainly something that, as I said, is referred to in the SNP's manifesto. So we don't want to see a policy of fire and rehire in any college in Scotland. There are specific disputes taking place here, and as I said previously, it's really important that both parties sit down and negotiate until these disputes are resolved. And I was pleased, of course, at the first stage of your own dispute in the national context between EIS FEHE and the Employment Employers Association, that you agreed there was no national policy. There was no national policy to replace lecturers with instructors and assessors. So now we've got these local disputes left to be resolved, and I urge everyone to please do that as quickly as possible.
Thanks for that, Richard. Just to correct you slightly, what we agreed was that there was no national plan, and that was on the basis that we accepted that in their current state, Colleges Scotland find it very difficult to plan anything. Whether they had policies or not is a different matter.
Yeah, okay, plan.
Okay, no problem. Michael?
You can call it a policy, or you can call it a budget settlement, and you can say, what happens as a result of the decisions that government makes. So if you leave colleges in a precarious situation where their finances, and right across the sectors, we've seen from Audit Scotland's review of this and evidence brought to the Audit Committee in Parliament, pretty clear that actually the balance sheets of quite a number of these institutions are frankly shot, then, they're going to come up with some crazy ideas. And frankly, this is a crazy idea. Your union has the full solidarity of the rest of the Labour movement and the Labour Party on this. I believe in this strike, certainly the Labour Party in this strike. I hope other trade unions are backing you in that regard as well. If this is unacceptable for large shareholder-driven capitalist companies like British Gas in terms of firing and rehiring, and then it should certainly be unacceptable in the public sector in Scotland, and more action should be taken immediately to do something about it.
Thanks very much, Michael. And just to round up this wee bit, just to make it quite clear as far as the EIS are concerned, we do believe that in the Forth Valley situation, there is ample opportunity for intervention to be made. It is fire and rehire. If you are prepared to say you're against fire and rehire, we would expect your political party, in or out of government, to be doing something about it to make sure it's ended. But that would certainly be our point. We'll move on to the next question, which again is from FE. And again, it is about, I suppose, the never-ending disputes that we seem to end up in. With national bargaining in place over the life of the last Parliament and strikes taking place repeatedly in that time, do you believe any changes are necessary to ensure national bargaining works effectively. Just so the panel are aware, there, and I'll probably get these figures wrong, we seem to never be off strike, but the last 5 years have seen 4 major strikes in the FE sector. I believe the last 7 years have seen 5 major strikes in the FE sector. That would probably suggest to a layperson that there's a fundamental problem in the structure of all of this that sees lecturers. We are lecturers after all. We're not. Well, I'll be careful what I say here, but we are lecturers. We're not here to be on strike every year. There does appear to be a problem. What steps would you take to ensure that we can get over this and that national bargaining actually works as national bargaining rather than national dispute? Could I start with yourself, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I know how Richard reacted to this earlier on in terms of when Ross used the word tripartite. But when you've got a recurring situation that comes up again and again and again, there's something broken in the process. And I put this to College of Scotland just the other day when I was having the conversation with their chief executive about actually what is going to change in terms of the policy situation or the behaviour of employers to actually shift this dynamic. If there has been a breakdown in trust or, frankly, a policy issue that is resulting in learners losing time in front of their lecturers and lecturers losing wages, it's nobody benefits out of this situation. So actually, if this is an ongoing cycle, as you describe, and I certainly think it is, then something has to be done to change that situation. Now, I hope this latest agreement has that effect, but we can't wait until next year just in case that it doesn't. There has to be intervention. There has to be a discussion with the unions and the employers on a considered basis, on a tripartite basis with government to say, let's not get back in this situation again next year. What can we do to deal with it? My feeling, though, is what both sides in that would say, the unions and the colleges, is one of the ways you can sort this is by funding us properly.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Richard.
Thanks. Firstly, there's been a 30% cash increase in the college budget since the SNP came to government. And as I said previously, that was against the backdrop of 10 years of austerity from the Tory government in Westminster. And I'd really ask Michael and his party to back the SNP government and indeed the Greens to try and tackle some of these issues rather than just always blaming the Scottish administration for the financial problems facing Scottish public services and HE and FE. What I would say is that I think we cannot have ongoing industrial disputes within the sector that can be avoided. And clearly there is something wrong at the moment, either with relationships or the structures. If it's relationships, clearly I don't know how that's solved immediately, but if there's something wrong with the structures, we have to identify that. I don't think the answer is for the government to become the third party around the table. Any opposition politician suggesting that would be setting a precedent for every conversation of this nature in every sector and across HE and FE. So I welcome your assurance that you're happy for that to happen. It's of course the responsibility of the employers and the union representatives to sort this out. But I think where the government can assist is to ensure that there is a lessons learned exercise and that external people are part of that. And, that is the plan at the moment. So that will happen. And I think from my conversations previously with EIS FEHE and indeed the Employers Association, that we recognise a lessons learned exercise is absolutely crucial and that we do make changes if they're necessary.
Okay, thank you very much. Ross?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've already laid out what the Greens believe could be solutions to this. We need to make Scottish Funding Council funding more conditional. On Richard's point around, if you went down the road of tripartite negotiation in colleges, it somehow sets out a precedent for universities. No, I mean, what's right for the college sector is not automatically right for universities, and most obviously it's because colleges are public bodies and universities are not. There's more direct accountability here. Far greater proportion of colleges funding comes directly from the public sector compared to, as Richard himself pointed out, it's about 40% for universities. What I'm proposing is not a like for like of the SNCT model. I think it's a useful example, but teachers are different from lecturers, schools are different to colleges. But the point is, Michael said, we need to break the cycle, and at the very least, having government observers in the room to see how Colleges Scotland's negotiators behave and what they say in the room versus what happens outside of the room, I think would be quite informative for the government. I also mentioned reform of the boards at individual colleges, because I think the benefits of that would flow downstream to Colleges Scotland's negotiating position. And I get the impression, and certainly from speaking to folk in the union, I think they get the impression as well, that we do have an issue with a couple of individual institutions, and really I think a couple of individual principals who have in some cases just cut the legs out from under their own negotiators, where what the position put forward by Colleges Scotland in the room isn't actually a position that those principals then sign up to. So you end up with, it's impossible for the unions negotiators to do their job because the people they're negotiating with in the room then have to go back to principals who won't sign up to stuff that was nominally put on the table in their name. So we need to break this cycle. That means governance changes at every level. I'm not saying I'm absolutely wedded to tripartite negotiation, but I think the government does need to step in here in a much more meaningful way. And we should at least be asking the question, is that an adequate solution? Because at the moment, we're putting forward proposals for how we think this could be solved. I'm not seeing proposals coming from the government on how to actually break this cycle, despite the fact that we've been in it for, as Charlie pointed out, about 7 years.
Thanks very much, Ross. Gordon?
Yes, well, I mean, Richard's suggestion that there's been a problem with funding from the UK government is utter nonsense. The SNP government has received from Westminster through the Barnett formula huge sums of funding, and what they've done with that is often held it back rather than use it for equivalent purposes to what it was used south of the border. So I don't accept that at all. I think Michael made some very good points about this whole issue, and I think that part of the problem is we need a change of culture in this country generally when it comes to the question of disputes and people being willing to reach agreement. I mean, there are other countries, for example, Germany, they had no legal enforceable minimum wage until very recently. Partly because unions and employers would sit down and would discuss and agree what was a reasonable wage in the area in question for the type of work the workers involved. And that was done by mutual agreement. Now, I think we need to try and get more into that frame of mind in this country. And that involves looking at things a bit more long-term, a bit more planned, both from the point of view of government and colleges and educational institutions, and then agreement between parties.
Thanks, Gordon. Liam?
I think I would offer the warning, beware politicians bearing silver bullets. I think particularly in the run-up to an election. I think, as Ross has identified, there are issues here that are to do with individuals. And as Michael's pointed out, there are structural issues in terms of the funding within the college sector as a whole, and there's similar but different issues in the university sector. The fact that we're seeing this cyclical is in nobody's interest, not in the interests of lecturers and staff, it's not the interest of students, it's not in the interests of taxpayers, it's not in the interests of the economy as a whole. I think back to the point that I think both Ross and I were making earlier in relation to a job of work that an incoming education and skills, or however it's defined, committee might be able to undertake in the first 6 months of the next parliament. This would seem to fit very neatly within it, because the national policy doesn't appear to be having the effect that it's supposed to have. And we as legislators love saying, well, we've passed legislation, so that's the job done and we're going to move on to the next thing. This would appear to be an example of whatever the effect we thought that policy decision was going to have, it's not having that effect, and therefore it's an area where a bit of post-legislative scrutiny and due diligence done by the incoming education committee, again, I think would be greatly useful.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd love to chase you all the more on these sorts of issues, but I've been far too lax as it is tonight. So because of that, we're going to have to speed things up a bit. We're going to jump to question 10, and my equivalent, my better even, at the ULA. Holly Patrick, the president of ULA, is going to introduce that question to you. Holly, would you do so?
Thanks, Charlie. So SRUC, or Scotland's Rural College, is a hybrid FEHE institution that was formed in 2012. And EIS is currently balloting members at SRUC over their pay and conditions, getting a pay and grading system that reflects the sector norms. And this is because, although in previous years the Scottish Government has provided financial support to the HE sector to achieve a national pay framework and supported the FE sector to achieve national pay structures, and of course supported the school structure as well, SRUC has been excluded from all of those settlements, and now leaves us in a place where SRUC academics are paid thousands of pounds less than their colleagues at other institutions to deliver all levels of education up to PhD. So the question would be, does the panel think it's acceptable to treat rural academics in a less favourable way? And what action would you take to try and correct the unequal and unfair treatment of the rural tertiary education sector by the government?
I'll try that with my mic on this time. Ross, would you like to answer first?
Yeah, thanks. So I think my answer to this would go back to one of the questions that we've not quite had time for, which is the wider issue of in higher education of the potential for national collective bargaining, which is something the Green Manifesto is committed to trying to expand national bargaining for not just across the public sector, but what we describe as like public sector adjacent or significantly publicly funded sectors. As you pointed out, the challenge with SRC or SRUC is kind of sitting between two sectors, HE and FE. So I think we maybe need to think creatively about how it can be involved in national collective bargaining, but there's no reason for it not to be. But again, a lot of this simply comes back to everything that I mentioned previously around, this is an institution that receives large amounts of public money. We should simply be making that conditional on decent employment practices. We should be providing that basic floor of good standards in employment. If we had devolution of employment law in Scotland, we could clearly go much further with it. Trying to work out the exact model by which the SRC could be integrated into national bargaining is tricky, because on the one hand, you need to actually make that the case in higher education, and that would be met with a lot of resistance, although your union is very good at defeating resistance even when it's intense from management. And with FE rather, there is a national collective bargaining structure. SRC might not quite fit into it, but I don't think this is an insurmountable problem. So I mean, the short answer is yes.
Thanks, Ross. Michael.
Yeah, I have to say it's not a particular case that I know a great deal about, Holly. But I think your question at the end comes to the core of it. Should rural academics be treated differently to other academics? And the answer to that is no. I don't think it requires further devolution of anything to agree that principle and to try and do something about it. These are public bodies in Scotland funded by the government. We can take action on that as governments. So if there is issues of discrepancy across, that's what trade unions exist to do something about. So I understand why you're asking the question. It's certainly something I'd be happy to work with the EIS to discuss and to pursue more in the new session, and to try and combat if that's a discriminatory practice between one part of the sector and another, then action should be taken. I don't think it requires big legislation to do it. It takes political will.
Thanks, Michael. Gordon?
Yes, I mean, I don't think they should be subject to more unfavourable conditions. I think the rural sector in all areas often needs more support sometimes than those in urban areas. And I mean, indeed, the Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross, one of the things he is campaigning on, or the party is campaigning on, is a fair deal for the North East and indeed rural areas. So although I'm in Edinburgh, of course, but I do think that we have to get the balance right and ensure that the education sector and the college sector that is in the more remote places in the country has a fair deal.
Okay, thank you, Liam.
I know we're running out of time here, Charlie, but as somebody who's represented Orkney over the last 14 years, it'll not surprise you to hear that I entirely agree that rural-based academics should be treated on a par with their urban counterparts. I recall similar issues arising in relation to UHI as well. I think Michael's absolutely right in that there's a resolution to that. In fact, Ross as well, there's a resolution to this. I think through the involvement of the unions, and it wouldn't necessarily need any changes to the powers, just a willingness on the part of management, unions, and with the support, I would hope, across the parties of achieving that outcome. But it does nobody any favours to have institutions that are operating with an unfair bias towards some professionals over others. I think that can readily be addressed.
Okay, Richard.
Thanks. I'm interested in Gordon's claim that the Conservatives want a better deal for rural areas, given that Brexit's hit the UHI and SRUC and our rural areas. Everywhere else, so maybe we get a better deal from the UK government. In terms of this question, though, I absolutely agree that...
1 second, Richard. Could I ask, if you're not using the microphone, could you turn it off, please? We're getting a lot of feedback there. Carry on, Richard.
I agree with the others that because an academic's based rurally, they should not be facing any disadvantages. And I hope that if this is leading into dispute, that both parties are able to reach an amicable resolution to this. It does strike me that the hybrid nature of the SRUCs, as others have said, is at the heart of this. So I'd be keen, if the SNP government's re-elected, for you to discuss this further with us.
Okay, Richard. Do we have time for question 9? Can we go back to that, or are we out of time? Somebody tell me. Holly, do you want to ask question 9? Is that okay?
Sure, thanks, Charlie. Economically driven cuts have resulted in colleges running in deficit with an impact on student learning experience. What can and should be done to ensure that the funding of further education is protected and strengthened?
Okay, we need to be very brief with this if we can. Liam, can I start with yourself?
Yeah, I think, as I said in my opening remarks, I think the funding set up within colleges has been unsustainable for some time. All sorts of promises were made when the SNP government reorganised, restructured, and cut hundreds of thousands of part-time courses. None of those promises have manifested themselves. Scottish Liberal Democrats are committed to at least beginning to readdress that. I think it will take some time, but funding through the Scottish Funding Council will need to be the mechanism. However, that's tied to conditionality for certain outcomes. But the route we're on at the moment is just not sustainable.
Okay, thank you. Gordon?
Yes, I mean, I covered this in my opening remarks, and I think I've commented on it further, that the whole funding model needs reviewed, and Scottish Conservatives are wanting this to be properly discussed and thought through in the course of the next Parliament.
Okay, thank you for your brevity. Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I think that the version of the question that I saw said that it was economically driven cuts. I think it's pretty bad economics, frankly. If you're not actually investing in your people, you're not going to get the outputs that you want. And so at the end of the day, we know that our college sector has a vital role to play in a recovery. It has to be protected. It has to be nurtured. And I do again say, there are too many colleges whose balance sheets are highly precarious, and that leads to some of the practices we've been talking about tonight.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. I mean, the recent budget that the SNP government delivered a couple of months ago gave a substantial uplift to the college's budget that was warmly welcomed by the sector, and that was the highest uplift for some time. And that's over and above the COVID consequentials that have been passed to the college sector and FE and HE as well, which has also been welcomed. So the situation has been eased somewhat for Scotland's sector at the moment, but I'm not disputing that, of course, there's financial challenges facing the sectors as it does many other sectors. And that's why I have commissioned the Scottish Funding Council to look at the financial sustainability of FE and HE and its coherence going forward, given that we're all agreed that FE and HE has got a central role to play in supporting our young people in the years ahead and, importantly, the Scottish economy as well.
Thank you. Ross?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, the funding model needs to change. It's not sustainable. So the SFC review will be really interesting, really important. But the real question is here, where to get the money from? We clearly need more money. We need more money for our public services, and that includes our colleges. So that's why the Greens have proposed a wealth tax on millionaires. We've already made changes to income tax. The changes that the Greens made to income tax in Scotland a couple of years ago have resulted in about an additional £500 million being raised for our public services that wouldn't have otherwise. And that's being raised from the richest, the highest income individuals. Those on the lowest incomes actually got a small tax cut as a result of those changes. There are still some more changes that we can and should be making to income tax at the highest levels. But we need to be serious about tackling wealth. Even the International Monetary Fund, who are hardly the Greens' bedfellows on the loony left of economics, have said that we need to start taxing wealth, particularly in Scotland. That's where so much of this is tied up. So we're proposing the millionaires tax on wealth, proper land reform, because the tax avoidance related to that is shocking. We need to scrap the council tax and let local councils raise their own funds like normal European local governments so that national budgets can be properly redeployed. The question about funding any particular sector that is funded by government is ultimately a question of how does the government raise its money. And the Greens are quite clear that the wealthiest, the richest people in our society who have got richer during this pandemic should be the ones who pay for the recovery.
Thank you very much, Ross. Did everybody get to answer there? I've kind of lost my place, I think. Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. We're going to have one more question, and then after that, I'll ask you all to tell the lecturers in further and higher education why they should vote for your party. I'm going to ask Holly to ask the final question from the HE side.
Thank you. Really quick one. Over the last few years, EIS has been engaged in national level, UK level, bargaining for the HE sector at the same time as the FE sector has had Scottish level bargaining. During that time, pay has fallen by 17%. Would you support national bargaining in Scotland for the HE sector?
Okay, Richard.
Well, clearly, one of the reasons we face the financial challenges, as I said before, but apparently Gordon says it never happened, was 10 years of austerity from the UK government that took us right up to pre-COVID. And our universities are independent institutions, and we don't have the same influence over their approach to national bargaining or these policies. However, I'm willing to hear the case, and it's certainly not a commitment in our manifesto, I accept that. So it's something that we'd be happy to look at the pros and cons of and discuss with you. But obviously, I can't make a commitment to that tonight on behalf of the SNP manifesto. But I do recognise that we can't allow a deterioration in the salary levels and the funding of HE.
Okay, Liam.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I've said before, if we're to value the sector, we need to value those working within the sector. I would have some, I think, questions, if not misgivings, about how national bargaining in the HE sector might work. But clearly there are issues in terms of certain types of roles within the sector and the casualisation of roles, as we touched on earlier, that absolutely need addressed, and would be supportive of any initiatives to address that.
Thanks very much, Ross.
Yes, we published a paper about 18 months ago now about a Green New Deal for workers, and the expansion of collective bargaining. National collective bargaining is a key part of that. As I mentioned, we've put it in our manifesto to expand collective bargaining to publicly funded sectors, so sectors out with public sector, but like the HE sector, get a lot of public money. So this is something that we would certainly be very keen to pursue. I mean, we have a track record here that the Greens worked with the EIS, when teachers were campaigning for the 10% pay rise, the £150 million that was needed to get that was a condition of that the Greens put into our agreement on the national budget that year in 2018 into 19. So we have a track record of working with unions when it is national collective bargaining. Certainly keen to see that expanded into HE. I think we need to learn the lessons from national collective bargaining in further education, though, because clearly it only takes a couple of people on one side of the negotiations to make a concerted effort to bring the whole thing down and grind it out every single year. So yes, we should do it. We should learn what isn't working about the collective bargaining arrangements in further education before we introduce it in higher education, though. That doesn't mean we should slow down that process. It just means learn those lessons while we work to introduce it in HE.
Thanks very much. Gordon? Gordon? Okay. Michael, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. As a lifelong trade unionist, I believe that workers coming together in whatever sector across nations, across borders, across boundaries is the way that we actually deliver real change. Stronger trade unions are stronger economies, are stronger countries. And if that means that you, as trade unionists, want to pursue collective national bargaining, I absolutely support it.
Okay, thank you. We seem to have lost Gordon. We've lost our Tory, I'm afraid. We're coming to the end of the night, colleagues. I want to thank everybody for turning up and everybody for doing all the work. But I want us all to have one last chance to hear why we should vote. And I'm just going to take you in the order that I can see you all on the screen. So I'm going to start with yourself, Liam. Tell us why we should vote for your party.
Just wondering why Gordon didn't have a body double much like yourself, Charlie. Listen, thanks. Thanks very much indeed for hosting this evening's event. I think, as I started out by saying, the next 5 years, as far as I'm concerned, needs to have a laser-like focus on the recovery, and in that sense, a recovery within education, which is a sector overall which has been particularly hard hit. There were issues there before the pandemic. I think nobody would necessarily shy away from that, and many of those have only got worse. I think from our perspective, in terms of the FE and HE sector, again, as we've covered this evening, we need to address the unsustainable funding models in both sectors. That can be done, I think, in large part through the Scottish Funding Council, and we certainly look to do that. I think accessing that education so that we can rebuild and we can repurpose the economy is something we want to see happen, and colleges in particular are going to be crucial to that, but so too universities. We want to see a training bond that opens up that accessibility, that I think reverses some of the problems. Sorry?
Need to hurry, yeah.
All right, okay. That addresses some of the problems that have arisen from the 140,000 college places that were cut by the SNP government, and we need to value staff. Again, that's a theme we've covered this evening. There are clearly problems in both sectors that need addressing, and Scottish Liberal Democrats would be very keen to see that addressed as an order of priority.
Okay, thank you. Ross.
Thanks. I hope that I've been able to demonstrate tonight the track record that the Greens have and the understanding that we have of these issues. You know, our agenda in further and higher education is the same agenda as your union. We have stood with you on picket lines, at rallies. We have raised your issues in Parliament. We have met with and challenged college principals, university principals, and their management associations. The Greens have put in the work on this over the last 5 years, and our manifesto proposes transformational change in education, in all sectors of education, over the next 5 years as well. You know, our strapline in this election is vote like our future depends on it. And that's primarily a reference to the climate crisis that we face and Scotland's constitutional future. But it's absolutely the case when we're talking about further and higher education as well. You know, the future that we envisage for these sectors is ones that are thriving, where staff are treated well. And you know, your as I said earlier on, your working conditions are your students' learning conditions. There's no way for us to even maintain, never mind improve the high standard of teaching and learning in our universities and colleges without defending and improving the pay and conditions of staff. We understand these issues. We've put forward solutions to them, and I hope that our work over the last 5 years, not just what I've said tonight, is enough to persuade you to lend your vote to the Greens at this election.
Thanks very much, Ross. Richard.
Thank you, and thank you for tonight. There's a lot of issues to take away and to reflect upon that people have made very good points over as well. Under the SNP stewardship over recent years in government, our colleges have exceeded their targets. We have now record students at our universities, and both sectors very much underpin the Scottish economy. And importantly, they're offering the young people of Scotland in particular the opportunity to better their lives and increase their life chances and opportunities, irrespective of their background or where they come from. And that widening access agenda has been a big priority for the SNP government and will continue to be going forward. But we're now at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads to recover from COVID, to tackle the climate emergency, given Scotland's demographic changes and given Brexit, as well as the technological revolution that our economy faces in the years ahead. And I believe the SNP's manifesto is a range of proposals that are best placed to make sure we're working in partnership with our education institutions and FE and HE to take that forward. And our SFC, Scottish Funding Council review, will be fundamentally important to determine the future direction of FE and HE in Scotland. And finally, by voting both votes SNP, we'll get a majority government that can deliver the next independence referendum and give our young people, again, in particular, the most prosperous future and take our own destiny into our own hands. So we're not taking out of Europe against our will, and we can rejoin and bring more benefits for our research institutions, HE, FE, and our young people who've lost their rights as well.
Thank you very much, Richard. I never thought I'd come close to hurrying you up, but thanks very much. Michael.
Well, what I've heard tonight in the questions and speaking to your members, Charlie, over the recent weeks in these various hustings and conversations is that people feel across these sectors that we do need change. If you want more of the same that you've had in the last over 5,000 days, then yeah, listen to Richard. You know, if you want more of these practices of 0-hour contracts, if you want less funding, if you want the kind of situations of industrial dispute and rancour that we have had, if you want an education system that isn't performing as high as it used to in international norms and league tables, then yeah, that's the way to go. We live in a deeply uncertain world with huge challenges coming in the next year to 2 years to 3 years. A massive task to change our course, to actually deliver ourselves and recover from this pandemic. I believe that a vote for the Labour Party, a Labour Party that shares the values of the trade union movement, is the best vote to ensure a better future for Scotland. And I would encourage you to consider doing so next Thursday.
Thanks very much, Michael. And I've possibly just seen the best ever tactic to ensure you get to be the last person. Gordon, do you want to tell us very quickly why we should vote for it?
Well, in fairness to me, that's a long-standing external fault that I think BT Openreach have not been able to sort. And my internet is usually superb here in the city centre of Edinburgh, but there is this fault that nobody seems able to sort out. So not a tactic on my part. I think what the Scottish Conservatives want to see is a proper reform of the funding system for the higher education and further education sector. We recognise that the setup as it is not working. There may be systemic issues, but there is sufficient funds there if properly managed, administered and applied to the questions and issues. And the SNP government has simply failed over the past 14 years. They've had to get this right. They've failed. It's time to change the government. And it's time to stop wasting time talking about an issue that we decided in 2014 and move on from the question of independence. So vote Scottish Conservative, both votes.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe vote BT for one of them as well, who knows. I'd like to thank the entire panel. Thank you very much for your time. Obviously, I want to thank everybody who has come along. I hope Holly and I have managed to provide you with some answers to some of the questions and the issues, and at least get the opportunity to question the politicians. Hopefully we'll hear from them all well before another 5 years, another election comes round. Thank all the organisers for all the hard work they've done behind the scenes. And from an FE point of view, the fight against fire and rehire, particularly at Forth Village College, continues, and our colleagues in ULA will continue to fight for better job protection and conditions and pay. Our struggles will continue. Hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.